Everyday life in America is breaking down faster than anyone wants to admit. Utility bills that once averaged $150 are now exploding past $600. Medical premiums are jumping 30 to 40%. Nearly 45 million households are behind on at least one essential payment. Half the country has less than $500 in savings, while credit card balances just crossed $1.3 trillion. Rent hikes, $7 water bills, turning into $700, and grocery prices up more than 25% since 2020. This isn't a slowdown. It's a system unraveling in real time. The collapse isn't coming, it's already inside the American home. The first visible fracture in everyday American life appears inside the household budget, where basic bills now outrun the income meant to cover them. What used to be manageable monthly expenses have transformed into destabilizing financial shocks. Electricity bills that hovered around $150 to $200 have ballooned into $500 to $900. Water bills in several states are surpassing $600. Gas, sewer, and trash fees have climbed at double-digit rates. A family earning $4,500 a month is watching more than $2,000 vanish before groceries, insurance, or transportation are even considered. For millions, the numbers simply no longer line up. This erosion becomes more alarming when viewed alongside payment behavior. Household data shows only 55% of bills are being paid on time, and 15% aren't being paid at all. That is not a budgeting mistake. That is an economy where essential services have slipped beyond the reach of ordinary workers. As incomes stagnate while expenses surge, people are not choosing which comforts to sacrifice. They are choosing which necessities to delay. A skipped payment isn't a strategy. It's a warning signal from households operating at the edge of collapse. Every category that once formed the foundation of stable living is undergoing the same pressure. Car insurance premiums rising 22% in a year. Internet and phone plans quietly adding $10 to $30 per month. Heating costs up more than 40% in colder regions. These are not luxury items. These are the operational costs of modern life, and they are now consuming a record share of after-tax income. For many, the paycheck arrives already pre-allocated to obligations that exceed it, turning work into a treadmill that moves faster every month. What begins as rising expenses ends as a structural imbalance, where households cannot absorb another increase without breaking something else. And once the home environment becomes financially unstable, everything connected to it, work, health, mobility, and spending, begins to deteriorate in sequence. This internal breakdown sets the stage for the wider economic unraveling happening outside the front door. The pressure inside the American household didn't appear out of nowhere. It was engineered by a structural squeeze that has been tightening for more than a decade. Inflation has pushed the cost of essentials up by 20 to 40% across major categories, but wage growth has not kept pace. The median worker earning around $58,000 a year is experiencing real purchasing power that resembles the late 1990s, while expenses resemble a country operating on a far higher income. The gap between what life costs and what work pays has become a permanent deficit embedded into the system. This imbalance becomes sharper when measured against productivity. Workers have increased output by more than 60% since the early 2000s, yet real compensation has barely moved. The value created by labor is flowing upward, while the paycheck has remained anchored. This is why even full-time employment no longer guarantees stability. The structural design prioritizes asset owners, not wage earners, leaving millions squeezed between rising prices and static income. And now, a new force is amplifying the squeeze: the rapid integration of artificial intelligence into white-collar and service sectors. Companies are openly projecting reductions in labor needs by 20 to 30%, and internal models estimate that nearly 40 million positions could face wage suppression or displacement. Unlike previous automation waves that targeted manufacturing, this one targets administrative roles, analysts, designers, customer service, logistics coordinators, the backbone of middle-income America. The result is a wage ceiling that is no longer set by skill, experience, or merit, but by software capable of replicating part of the job at near zero marginal cost. Even workers who keep their positions are finding salary negotiations capped or reversed. When a company can justify paying $62,000 instead of $78,000 because an AI system performs 25% of the workload, bargaining power collapses instantly. This isn't a labor market adjustment. It is a structural transition into a world where income growth is no longer expected. Without wage expansion, households lose the only tool that historically offset inflation. And when income cannot rise, every new cost increase becomes irreversible. The squeeze inside paychecks directly fuels the instability already visible inside the home. What households are experiencing isn't mismanagement. It is the predictable outcome of an economy where prices climb, wages freeze, and technology accelerates the imbalance faster than workers can adapt. As wages flatten and essential costs rise, the financial gap inside the American home is being filled by the only tool left available: debt. The country has quietly transitioned into a credit-funded society where survival, not comfort, depends on borrowing. Total household debt has surged past $17.5 trillion, with credit card balances alone crossing $1.3 trillion, the highest level ever recorded. This is not discretionary spending. It is the financial oxygen Americans now rely on to bridge the distance between earnings and the cost of living. The most alarming trend is the structural normalization of revolving debt. Millions are carrying balances at interest rates that now average 22 to 28%, levels that would have been considered predatory a decade ago. Auto loans are extending to 72 to 84 months because shorter terms have become unaffordable. Buy now, pay later systems have embedded themselves into everyday purchases, fragmenting payments into digestible pieces while inflating long-term obligations. The financial architecture is designed to offer credit instead of income, creating a treadmill where repayment becomes mathematically impossible for a growing share of households. Delinquencies reflect the breaking point. Credit card late payments have climbed above 5%, auto loan delinquencies are at decade highs, and missed utility and insurance bills are spreading across income tiers once considered stable. This is the early stage of a debt spiral. When obligations accumulate faster than repayment capacity, the outcome is not stress, it is systemic erosion. The consequences extend far beyond personal finance. As households depend on credit to fund basic consumption, the broader economy becomes artificially propped up by borrowed money. Retail sales, service activity, and even food spending are being supported by credit expansion, not wage strength. When credit availability tightens or borrowing limits are reached, spending will contract abruptly, exposing how fragile the consumer base truly is. This debt-dependent model was never sustainable. It masks the structural squeeze discussed earlier, delaying the impact rather than solving it. The gap between earnings and expenses is no longer bridged by income growth, but by obligations that compound monthly. The weakening of household finances has collided with a labor market that can no longer supply consistent, dependable work. Jobs aren't just disappearing in distressed industries. The decline is spreading into sectors once considered immune to downturns. Skilled trades, real estate services, home maintenance, logistics, administrative support, and professional contracting are all reporting the same trend: fewer clients, fewer hours, and fewer opportunities. Indicators show the shift clearly. Job openings have fallen by more than 2.5 million from their peak. Part-time positions are replacing full-time roles at the fastest pace since the last major recession. Industries that depended on steady consumer activity, inspections, repair work, local contracting, are experiencing workloads that have dropped between 20% and 40%. Mortgage processors in cities like Las Vegas and Phoenix report origination volumes that resemble the aftermath of the 2008 crash. Even well-reviewed tradespeople are experiencing multi-week gaps without a single paid job. What makes this decline so dangerous is that it's not being caused by one sector failing, it's being caused by a population pulling back simultaneously. Strained households are delaying non-essential repairs, reducing service spending, and avoiding new commitments. When millions cut back at once, entire categories of employment lose their foundation. Work doesn't vanish because the skills aren't needed. It vanishes because consumers can't afford to hire anyone. Layered on top of the consumer pullback is the corporate pivot toward automation and consolidation. Companies are compressing staff to protect profit margins, replacing administrative layers with software, and reducing labor needs by digitizing workflows. As firms adopt new systems, payroll becomes one of the first targets. The shift is significant. Internal surveys show nearly 30% of employers planning workforce reductions, tied to automation over the next 2 years. This dual pressure, weakened demand from households and structural downsizing from corporations, is reshaping the labor market into something far more unstable. Employment still exists, but predictability does not. The irregular work patterns forming now are undermining the financial rhythms that households depend on. And when work becomes inconsistent, the entire economic system becomes incapable of supporting the illusion of resilience displayed by financial markets and corporate earnings. While households struggle to keep the lights on and work becomes increasingly unstable, Wall Street behaves as if it lives in a different country entirely. Stock indexes are setting record highs, some crossing 5,400 points, even as consumer delinquencies surge and real economic activity contracts. This disconnect is not an accident. It's the result of a financial system that no longer reflects the condition of the population it supposedly represents. Corporate profitability has been re-engineered to grow without broad economic strength. Layoffs now trigger stock rallies because removing thousands of workers instantly improves quarterly margins. Share buybacks, which exceeded $1 trillion across major companies, artificially inflate earnings per share without generating a single new job or product. AI adoption announcements add hundreds of billions in market value, not because they create growth, but because investors anticipate reduced payroll expenses. In other words, the market rewards contraction, not expansion. Meanwhile, a shrinking consumer base, strained by inflation and debt, is masked by temporary revenue boosts driven by credit spending. Companies still post solid sales numbers because households are borrowing to survive. Wall Street interprets these revenues as signs of stability, even though they are built on balances that cannot be paid back. The illusion persists because financial markets measure transactions, not the financial health behind them. Monetary policy adds another layer to the mirage. Even the hint of lower interest rates can add $300 to $500 billion in market capitalization overnight. Investors view rate cuts as liquidity injections, not signals of economic distress. But historically, rate cuts occur when the real economy weakens, meaning the very events that should trigger caution now ignite speculative enthusiasm. What emerges is a two-tiered reality: a financial economy inflated by algorithms, stock buybacks, and debt-fueled consumer activity, and a real economy where wages stall, expenses accelerate, and work becomes uncertain. Wall Street thrives precisely because the pressures facing households push corporations to prioritize cost-cutting above all else. This widening disconnect cannot last indefinitely. Markets can ignore household strain for a time, but they cannot escape the consequences of a population too financially exhausted to sustain demand. And as the illusion thins, the fault lines begin to spread into the heart of America's most important system. That is housing. The housing system, once the backbone of American economic stability, is now signaling a deeper breakdown. Home sales have collapsed to levels not seen in 30 to 40 years, with annualized transactions falling below 4 million, a threshold historically associated with recessionary periods. Inventory remains artificially tight, not because demand is strong, but because existing homeowners are trapped by mortgage rates they cannot afford to give up. A household with a 3% loan cannot transition into a market demanding 7% without absorbing an additional $700 to $1,200 per month, an impossible jump for most families already stretched thin. This freeze in mobility has paralyzed entire segments of the economy. Mortgage originations have fallen more than 60% from their peak, leaving loan officers, inspectors, appraisers, and title workers with unprecedented downtime. Construction projects in mid-tier markets are being delayed or abandoned as financing costs surge and buyers evaporate. The ripple effect extends to home improvement spending, which has contracted sharply as homeowners postpone repairs, upgrades, and non-essential maintenance. The result is a housing ecosystem starved of transaction flow, one that depends on movement, not stagnation, to remain healthy. Renters face a different but equally destabilizing pattern. While some cities show slight cooling, the national median rent remains $300 to $500 higher than pre-2020 levels. Insurance premiums for multifamily buildings are rising 20 to 35%, pushing landlords to pass costs directly to tenants. Property taxes in many counties have climbed by double digits due to reassessed valuations and local budget shortfalls. These increases filter down into monthly rent demands, leaving tenants with fewer affordable options and shrinking margins for basic survival. Even retirees who once relied on fixed income stability are being pushed into financial uncertainty as HOA dues, maintenance fees, and insurance surges outpace their income streams. A retirement budget built on predictable costs can no longer absorb these increases without sacrificing essentials. Housing isn't just unaffordable, it's structurally malfunctioning. It no longer serves its core social purpose of providing stable shelter and predictable costs. Instead, it has become a pressure chamber where immobility, inflated rents, and rising overhead collide. And when a nation's housing system deteriorates, the shockwave doesn't stay contained. It spills directly into the small businesses, service workers, and local economies that depend on stable households to survive. Unlike large corporations with credit lines, automation budgets, and investor buffers, local enterprises operate on margins so thin that even a 5 to 10% drop in customer activity can destabilize them. What's unfolding today is far worse. Across retail, repair services, dining, personal care, home maintenance, transportation, and professional contracting, spending reductions between 15% and 35% are being reported nationwide. A contraction deep enough to break thousands of community-level businesses without ever appearing in headline economic data. This is the quietest recession because it hides in plain sight. Fewer customers walk through the door, fewer appointments get booked, fewer service calls arrive, and revenue quietly erodes week after week. Restaurants that once served 200 covers a night now struggle to hit 120. Local repair shops are reporting their slowest month since the 2010 recovery. Independent retailers are cutting hours or closing one extra day a week because payroll has become impossible to maintain. These are not isolated anecdotes. They represent a structural downturn driven by households that simply no longer have discretionary income. Compounding the pressure is the explosion in operating expenses. Commercial insurance premiums are rising 15 to 30%. Utility bills for storefronts have jumped by hundreds of dollars per month. Wholesale input costs remain elevated, squeezing margins from the other direction. Many businesses that survived the pandemic are now facing a different kind of suffocation. Not from lockdowns, but from a customer base financially incapable of supporting them. Meanwhile, access to credit, a lifeline for small enterprises, is tightening. Banks have reduced approval rates for small business loans to nearly 50% below pre-2020 norms. Lines of credit are being cut or refrozen, and interest rates on short-term borrowing have climbed into the 11 to 14% range, making relief funding financially useless. Without the ability to borrow and without enough sales to self-sustain, thousands of businesses are entering a slow-motion collapse that remains invisible until the for-lease signs appear. The decline of small businesses is not merely an economic inconvenience. It is the erosion of community infrastructure. Local economies survive through proximity-based commerce, social interaction, and neighborhood-level employment. When these collapse, the surrounding community loses stability, identity, and financial circulation. As small businesses fade and local economies contract, the next layer of strain lands on community infrastructure. The systems meant to guarantee clean water, stable power, safe streets, and functional public services. These systems were already aging, but the financial pressure now hitting municipalities is accelerating deterioration at a pace that can no longer be ignored. Cities and counties facing shrinking tax revenues are raising fees, delaying maintenance, and cutting services, creating a feedback loop where rising costs land on residents who are already financially overextended. Utility departments are reporting operational deficits as energy, chemical treatment, and labor costs climb simultaneously. Water districts in several states have raised monthly charges by 20 to 50%, not to improve service, but simply to remain solvent. Electrical grids, burdened by outdated infrastructure and extreme weather, require billions in upgrades that local budgets cannot cover. Sewer and waste management departments are increasing rates by $15 to $40 per month across many regions. And even then, maintenance backlogs continue to grow. These adjustments reflect a system shifting from proactive investment to emergency patching. Public safety services are encountering the same financial fragility. Police departments face staffing shortages as recruitment collapses and experienced officers retire early. Fire departments in rural counties are operating with outdated equipment because replacement costs exceed $1 million per engine. Emergency medical services are reporting response delays due to rising call volumes, combined with dwindling personnel. As conditions worsen, coverage becomes uneven, creating pockets of communities exposed to slower or unreliable emergency response. Even basic community resources are under pressure. Libraries, recreation centers, and after-school programs are cutting hours or closing entirely. Public transit systems, already strained, are reducing routes as operational expenses outpace fare revenue. Road maintenance has fallen so far behind schedule that some counties admit to multi-year repair backlogs they cannot resolve without federal intervention. This erosion is not symbolic. It transforms daily life. When water reliability becomes questionable, when blackout risks increase, when emergency response slows, when streets remain unrepaired, residents experience a steady decline in quality of life that cannot be masked by national economic narratives. And as public systems weaken, the burden shifts back onto individuals. Individuals who are already financially strained, indebted, and struggling to maintain stability. By the time households are drowning in bills, wages have lost their upward mobility, and community systems are eroding. The American consumer reaches the threshold that defines the next phase of collapse. The point where spending stops not by choice, but by mathematical impossibility. For decades, the U.S. economy relied on a model where consumer spending made up roughly 70% of total economic activity. But that model is cracking under the weight of shrinking disposable income and rising financial obligations. Discretionary spending is collapsing across multiple sectors. Retail foot traffic in mid-tier stores is down 10 to 18%. Restaurant sales in non-tourist markets have fallen by double digits, and online orders are softening despite record promotional discounts. Households that once allocated $300 to $400 a month to dining, entertainment, clothing, or travel are scaling back to survival spending only. This shift isn't temporary. It reflects a structural change in behavior driven by exhaustion, uncertainty, and the disappearance of financial slack. Credit temporarily masks this contraction, but that mask is dissolving. More than 44% of Americans revolve their credit card balances month to month. Missed payments, rising APRs, and shrinking credit limits are cutting off access to borrowed money at the exact moment consumers need it most. Once credit utilization peaks, and for millions it already has, the forced pullback in spending becomes unavoidable. This breaking point ripples outward immediately. Businesses depend on predictable purchasing patterns to maintain payrolls, inventory cycles, and operating schedules. When consumers retreat, businesses retreat. Layoffs rise, hours drop, hiring freezes spread, and product lines shrink. A negative loop forms: households cut spending, businesses cut jobs, households lose more income, spending contracts again. Simultaneously, renters and homeowners squeezed by rising costs are sacrificing every non-essential to avoid losing their housing. Medical appointments are delayed, car repairs postponed, insurance downgraded. Preventive spending disappears first, followed next by lifestyle spending, and eventually by maintenance spending, the category that keeps households functioning. When millions stop maintaining what they own, homes, cars, appliances, health, long-term national deterioration accelerates. This moment, where consumers can no longer generate the demand that props up the economy, reveals the truth Wall Street refuses to recognize. You cannot fund a consumption-driven economy when its consumers are financially incapacitated. And that brings us into the final, unavoidable stage: the convergence of every pressure point into a single national unraveling. A collapse is never caused by one failure. It emerges when multiple systems break simultaneously, reinforcing each other until the entire structure becomes unstable. America is now entering that phase. Each crisis, household strain, wage stagnation, debt dependence, labor market fragility, corporate consolidation, housing dysfunction, small business decline, and weakening public infrastructure, is no longer isolated. They are interlocked gears turning in the same direction, accelerating the same outcome. When wages fail to keep pace with rising costs, households compensate with debt. When debt saturates, spending collapses. When spending collapses, businesses contract. When businesses contract, jobs evaporate. When jobs evaporate, tax revenue falls. When revenue falls, public systems decay. When infrastructure decays, costs rise further for households already struggling. Every layer feeds the next, forming a closed loop of economic degradation. At the same time, financial markets remain detached, sustained by stock buybacks, speculation, and corporate restructuring rather than genuine economic strength. This divergence creates a national illusion. Charts say things are improving while daily life becomes more unmanageable. In past cycles, the real economy and financial markets eventually reconnected. Today, the gap is so wide that the reconnection will feel less like a correction and more like a structural snap. The convergence also exposes a deeper systemic weakness. America is transitioning from a productive economy to a consumption-dependent one, yet its consumers can no longer consume. The middle class, once the stabilizing force, is being eroded by inflation, indebtedness, and shrinking opportunities. Home ownership is increasingly out of reach. Savings rates are near historic lows, and future earnings potential is being undermined by rapid automation. Without a financially stable population, the foundational assumption of perpetual growth becomes impossible to maintain. This is not simply an economic downturn. It is a national inflection point where the pressures that once appeared manageable are now reinforcing one another with increasing speed. A society cannot function when work becomes unstable, essentials become unaffordable, debt becomes unpayable, and public systems become unreliable. These failures accumulate until they transform the everyday routines of ordinary Americans. The ability to earn, spend, save, travel, plan, and live with predictability. The collapse of everyday life is no longer theoretical. It is measurable, visible, and accelerating. And as all these forces converge into a single trajectory, one truth becomes undeniable. A nation doesn't fall when a single system breaks. It falls when every system breaks at the same time.